Hello and welcome to today's video. This video is called Spiritual Puberty and the Awakened Ego. We're all familiar with the teenage angst and the true challenges of those who are transitioning from childhood to adulthood. Seen from the perspective of an adult or parent, this is simply a normal stage in development like any other. While it may be difficult at times to balance compassion and understanding with discipline and parental guidance, it's not generally something a healthy parent considers wrong or bad. But imagine a mature adult passing through this transformative upheaval. It would likely be quite annoying for peers to experience. Something that seems appropriate and not out of place in the teenage world just feels annoying and wrong coming from an adult. There just isn't any room for the compassion we express towards those we expect to be dealing with such changes. This is what it feels like to deal with a person who is in what I call a state of spiritual puberty, or might have the added condition I refer to as the awakened ego. Just like regular puberty, we all pass through a certain stage after an awakening in consciousness. There's an experience of transcendent or divine knowing that is so profound as to be powerfully life-altering. Our exposure to the divine truth of existence leaves us acutely aware of how ignorant most people in the general population are. We can clearly see how foolish we have been and how foolish most of us still are. We've reached a stage of transcendent consciousness, and it exposes how misguided most of the world is. This stage that I'm calling spiritual puberty is a transition from normal consciousness or ignorance to transcendent consciousness or awakened consciousness. There's a trend among spiritual seekers to assume that awakening in consciousness is wholeness or enlightenment, while it is definitely not. I speak more about this in my video Awakening as compared to Enlightenment, so I won't go into it here, but it's relevant. Spiritual puberty occurs in all three types of awakening: consciousness, heart, and being, but is definitely the most notable when it happens in consciousness. Awakening in the conscious mind is where we cognitively put our experience in perspective in our lives. It's how we make sense of it all, and during this transition we all learn to balance our newfound truth with the world as it is. Like its namesake, spiritual puberty is just as difficult and just as fraught with obstacles. Where you're in between the world of unconsciousness and the world of divine truth, and finding our balance takes time. Often what makes this easier is to have an awakening in one of the other dimensions, heart or being. In this manner, we're much more able to quickly find our spiritual legs, so to speak. A prevalent and disturbing condition during this process is what I've called awakened ego. This is where the mind-generated sense of self has been transcended enough to make one aware of the truth, but not enough to fully overcome the momentum occurring in the ego. Over a lifetime of ignorance, our egos build momentum and develop strong patterns that are not easily overcome. This is why so many of us awaken and then go back to sleep, often referred to as the got it lost it phase. For those of us who are the most egocentric, the process of awakening in consciousness includes countless bouts of conflict with the ego as it rises and subsides. Eventually, the ego's momentum winds down, and we're left much wiser and much more at peace. This often takes 10 or 20 years for the average person, so we're not talking about a quick process. It does bear mentioning that not everyone goes through this spiritual puberty. There's a rare individual who becomes spontaneously whole all at once, but this is highly unusual. In the state of the awakened ego, there's a blend of divine knowing and subtle egoic manipulation where the mind-generated sense of self is pursuing its survival by taking control of the awakening process. This is purely a survival mechanism for the ego and is to be expected. Its most prevalent trait is invisibility to the conscious mind. Since there is a lack of clarity in the awakened consciousness, the ego is able to hide under a false sense of wholeness. People suffering from awakened ego are often above average intelligence, which is one of the reasons they are in this condition in the first place. Those with high IQs have stronger egos than the average person. Just as physical bullies use their size and strength as a defense mechanism, the intellectually powerful are adept at manipulating the perception of personal experience, and using it for this purpose has become its own lifelong defense mechanism. By generally being smarter than others, the intellectual ego is even more insidious than the physical kind. In the world of criminal rehabilitation, these types of people are considered to be the hardest to help. A mind that is capable of convincing rationalizations, justifications, and deflection only requires a degree of narcissism to be the perfect storm of delusion. Unfortunately, narcissism is a common trait among the highly intelligent. Add a degree of transcendent consciousness to an intellectual ego, and you have the makings of an awakened ego. This isn't a one-size-fits-all model, but it gets the idea across. A person with an awakened ego displays many traits which tend to be fairly difficult to tolerate. Narcissism, arrogance, condescension, and judgment are among the most annoying of these traits. They truly believe they have it all figured out, and just about everyone else is totally lost by comparison. Not only do they know it all, they have a powerful desire to make sure everyone else hears about it. Their motivation is not to help others evolve, although that is exactly what they'll claim. Their motivation is purely self-defense in power over others. They troll forums and social media sites in a singular effort to point out how wrong everyone is who doesn't see it like they do. From their language, they display no compassion for others while making such claims as love is all that matters. By attempting to bring others down, they raise themselves up. Of course, we're not new to this type of person. Bullies are common, but a person who has had a spiritual awakening and uses it to bully is a bit of a different animal. Having had a genuine awakening at the level of consciousness, they have a degree of clarity and intelligence in what they say. They have strong relative opinions that are facts from their point of view, and when challenged, they vacillate between relative and absolute perspectives in order to dominate the conversation. Their awakened consciousness, coupled with intelligence, makes talking from the relative and absolute perspectives simultaneously sensible to them but confusing to anyone else. They can totally contradict themselves while arrogantly treating their perceived opponents as an imbecile. They can even do this while espousing the virtues of unconditional love and compassion. It's quite remarkable to behold, and doesn't take long for most people to assume they are talking to a total ass who is completely unaware of it. The more you try to reason with them, the deeper into their trap you fall. In the end, you are often left feeling that you've been pulled off your spiritual balance. You often regret having said anything at all, which is exactly where the awakened ego likes to have you. In pulling others off balance, the awakened ego finds its power and, more importantly, its security. As a condition arising from spiritual puberty, the awakened ego is something we all run into eventually if we frequent social media sites featuring spiritual awakening. In the stage of spiritual puberty, there are two common paths that are frequently encountered. People engaged in practices of complete presence, and people engaged in practices of complete absence. For us to be truly whole, we must strike a balance in presence and absence. Many people consider themselves completely whole when they have reached a state in either presence or absence, but this is an impossibility. Those who have transcended duality in mindfulness practice are truly in an awakened state of presence, but are not necessarily whole. They can suffer from an over-solidification of the watcher or observer. Since this state is truly transcendent, it can be mistaken for enlightenment, while it is actually consciousness trapped in presence. Likewise, there are those who transcend duality by leaping towards consciousness in absence. Solidification in absence can be recognized as one who abides in emptiness or void, and believes all else is illusion. Various states of samadhi or absorption are often considered enlightenment, while they are simply unconsciousness from the relative perspective. That's not to say that there are not positive and useful states of samadhi. It's only an observation that they're not all alike, except that they are generally states of absence. Almost everyone encounters some degree of solidification in the process of transcending duality. While abidance in presence and absence is a natural part of our consciousness in form, neither is the complete truth in and of itself. One who transcends duality is often overwhelmed by the intensity of the experience. It's easy to believe one has found the entire truth from either perspective. People often believe that if a little is good, then a lot is better, and so they intensify their movement toward whatever they were doing when they first had their awakening. In such a manner, one can become trapped in a cycle of practice that creates a self-fulfilling belief in success that is more like being on a hamster wheel than wholeness. Such people often become teachers who lead others into solidification of absence or presence. These teachers are themselves stuck in fragmented awakenings and are unfortunately promoting such fragmentation in their students. The pursuit of enlightenment becomes a consciousness-based focus that neglects a great deal of what is necessary to become actually whole. Wholeness is not found in the head space. To be fully whole requires awakened consciousness, awakened heart, and awakened being. Additionally, it requires the abidance and embodiment of balanced absence and presence from the divine center of self, the soul. There is a great deal more to wholeness than the spiritually pubescent realize, and an awakened ego is traveling a tangent that can take lifetimes to overcome. Let's go further into these models of presence and absence, which make up the bulk of activity in balancing spiritual puberty. People can have true and remarkable experiences in awakening consciousness through presence. Eckhart Tolle is a great example of one who leads many to awakening through presence. If his lessons are thoroughly understood, there is a flawless beauty in them that can lead one to a life of great peace and joy. Those who find awakened consciousness in absence are often unable to relate to Tolle's approach, but the end results are much the same. Mindfulness practices are popular practices in presence. To fully immerse oneself in each moment as it arises is truly an experience of awakened consciousness. In such practices, there is a great deal of focus placed on what is commonly called the watcher or observer. Our attention in each moment is focused on awareness itself. There are multiple points of view occurring in our awareness. Aware consciousness observes the environment through the personality or true sense of self that is the vehicle of our perception. Awareness can view our cognitive mind's interaction with the environment, and it can also observe the previously unconscious mind's reactions to the environment as filtered through our survival mechanisms. This includes the once unconscious mind-generated sense of self, or ego's interactions with the world. So all in all, we have awareness of several layers of consciousness occurring simultaneously. In practicing presence, the focus is often placed on only that which is actually happening and not on what the mind's various aspects of self are making out of it. Interpretation is put on a shelf, so to speak, and only experience is watched. Often this can include a denial of the fact that the personality or vehicle of our perception is itself a filter that cannot be bypassed. In such a manner, one can come to believe their own perception is the only perception. These activities of presence occur in the front portion of the skull. If one is sensitive enough, they can feel or sense the observer at the front of their headspace. Immediately behind it, they can feel or sense the conscious mind that perceives the observer itself. In spiritual puberty, those who claim presence as the mark of enlightenment remain in these layers of consciousness. There is a solidification of consciousness at the front of the headspace. The more this practice is focused on, the more ingrained this pattern of attention is solidified. In such a manner, one can become indefinitely stuck in presence. Something that is of great value and enjoyment can become a trap that requires some form of drama to overcome. Now let's look at those stuck in absence, possibly a more difficult type of spiritual puberty than being stuck in presence. Awareness in absence is found in layers of consciousness that are deeper in the headspace than those of presence. From the state of conscious mind where one can observe the observer, there is a transition into pure subjectivity where objective reality dissolves. This can be considered the dividing line between presence and absence. To move deeper and lower into the headspace is a movement into absence, while moving forward is the experience of presence. One who is sensitive can recognize these states and their physical location in the headspace while in meditation. The non-dual community is full of seekers and teachers who promote the concept of physical reality as an illusion, not real and empty of importance. These practitioners believe that reaching wholeness is the realization that form is an illusion, that the relative world of subject and object relationships is of no importance because it isn't real. They miss the most obvious truth, that all spiritual seeking and all spiritual realization arises in the form world and only exists as a form. Those who are stuck in absence have left conscious presence behind in one sense. While it is true that they are present in a state of absence, This often serves to confuse the matter rather than clarify it. The paradox of presence in absence is something that many of the spiritually pubescent are unaware of. They view their absence as real consciousness while seeing their presence in it as a part of the illusion. Of course, there are mutations of all kinds. One can be deluded in either direction by placing too much emphasis on either presence or absence. What often escapes those stuck in absence is that there is a sense of self in the perceiving of absence itself. The emptiness is being experienced by something specific. Often the awakened ego will claim something like the divine is experiencing itself, but this is impossible. The divine does not seek itself. There is no ignorance to overcome. Only those in form are unconscious and become conscious of the divine. As for the view that form is illusion, it must be understood that something is only an illusion or real based on the perspective it is being observed from. To God, we may be a dream. To us, our nighttime visions are dreams. Who's to say what is real? And more importantly, from the relative point of view within a given perspective, what difference does it make? None. The beauty of wholeness is the interplay between presence and absence, creating balance and paradox. What can be gained by an illusion realizing it's an illusion? This is a self-defeating observation. The very realization itself is proof of its inaccuracy. To further pretend that some deeper sense of consciousness is making the realization that the less conscious state is an illusion is itself proof of layers in consciousness. At what point does one layer decide that it is the real layer of consciousness? At what point does consciousness determine that it is an illusion? This is a cyclical and self-defeating practice that is detrimental to one's awakening and evolution into wholeness. For one to decide that such a realization is in fact proof of their enlightenment is even more detrimental, but that is what is happening to many who are in spiritual puberty these days. One has an experience of transcendent consciousness where they see the illusion of the egoic mind, and presto, they arrogantly conclude that they are enlightened. Regardless of what this world of form is, it's real to our bodies, it's real to all earthly forms, and to the earth itself. These bodies follow energetic laws that make them manifest, and these energetic laws are followed as one awakens in consciousness, heart, and being. Ignorance of these truths is a trap that can take lifetimes to evolve from. As humans, we seek wholeness from a relative perspective in physical form, and thus our success can only be measured in relative comparisons that occur in consciousness. While the divine may experience itself in unique relative separation, as a human, it is never unaware of the absolute fundamental nature of wholeness. Thus it is only from relative ignorance that the divine is sought, and once recognized remains a relative experience of that which is not relative, the absolute. One who is whole in form, meaning the body, is a walking, talking expression of the divine in presence and absence simultaneously. There is abidance in two dimensions at the same time, a paradox from the relative perspective, and a balanced expression of truth from the absolute perspective. So spiritual puberty is a stage where people tend to place greater value on certain layers of consciousness over others. This often leads to various schools of thought concerning what is the true awakened state. Variations are endless. One can be solidified in presence or solidified in absence, or a blend between the two. For the awakened ego, there can be a fortified position in either state, or there can be movement between the states based on the needs of the defense mechanism. What they all have in common is acute unawareness of their relative progress in the continuum toward wholeness. There is an assumption that most, if not all, of the journey is complete. Rather than realizing that one's evolution has just begun at a new and more meaningful level, one believes their evolution is complete. This is where a great deal of the spiritual community resides at this time in our history. While it may sound bad, it must be recognized that this is a step forward in human evolution, that we have reached this point. Mankind is finally crossing the threshold of consciousness in large numbers, and it will be our salvation if there is any to be had. Despite how difficult spiritual puberty seems, there is a cure for it. Just like the teenage variety, time and normal life will see to its evolution. Even the awakened ego will see an end to its lifespan. One thing that we can all be sure of in this transition, there will be some degree of suffering. Drama or suffering is the soul's use of personality to push one through their evolution. Suffering, while correctly perceived as mankind's vehicle of conscious evolution, is not always necessary, but is usually what happens. One either embraces life's ebb and flow or resists it. To resist it is the mark of the unconscious. To surrender and even embrace it is the sign of spiritual maturity and wisdom. For those in spiritual puberty, resistance and acceptance of life's ebb and flow is front and center in their focus. We accept what we can, we resist because we can't help it, and we reflect on the process. Through surrender, we find grace that allows us to truly transcend suffering and live in the world without resistance. At that point, everything becomes one and the same. Nothing and everything, full and empty. We strike a balance between presence and absence. Thanks for listening.